Countdown, Dibin, or should I just go? Okay. Good evening, everybody. Thank you for joining us. My name is Sankalita Shom, and I'm very excited to be conducting this design thinking webinar. So when Onroot approached me for doing this, initially I was very skeptical, of course, because design thinking by its very nature means that you conduct it in a group, you work in a group, you have teams. It's a very hands-on kind of a way of problem solving. We get into a problem together, we brainstorm solutions, we prototype, we test. So it's a very hands-on kind of an approach. Typically, I run 5-day workshops probably. But of course, then due to the pandemic, we all have had to adapt and to adopt new methods. And I thought it would be a good way to sort of just get started onto this through a webinar that is sort of going to give us an introduction into design thinking. But first, just to give a little background about myself and also how I got into design thinking and what sort of attracts me about design thinking is. So I trained and I worked as a corporate lawyer for many years in Mumbai at an international law firm. It was a cutthroat world of mergers, acquisitions, and there was a lot of excitement, long working hours. And then I transitioned as a trailing spouse, and I traveled to 3 different countries, and Bangladesh is my third country. And Dhaka has been my home now for the past 7 years, where I've been living and working actually for all these years. And I actually started using design thinking when I was working with a nonprofit where we were using technology to design solutions for women, children, and for the youth. When you're using technology to design digital products or services, it's very important to be mindful of the time. It's very important to be mindful of the cost that is involved. And design thinking helps you to sort of create products and services that can actually be useful for the user that you're designing for. Once you start doing that, there is no looking back. And then again, I was able to use design thinking when I was leading an accelerator, a business accelerator, where I worked with very early stage companies, some of them just at the ideation stage. So taking them through the processes of design thinking or through the steps of design thinking to actually reach a stage where they had a minimum viable product or a minimum viable service ready. So that's a little background about myself. And of course, then recently I have also started Activate, which is essentially a life skills company. And the reason behind this was that I feel that as we are moving forward, the kind of skills that will be required for us to either work or to live is not something which a traditional education system equips us for. And this is actually now more true with the pandemic happening and we having to change our way we live, the way we work. And some of these changes are probably going to be permanent. If I look at myself, at my life as well, so though I professionally trained as a lawyer and worked as a lawyer, it was only because I was able to keep an open mindset. It was only because I was flexible. It was only because I was curious and adventurous that I was able to still do meaningful work in all the 3 locations and have a good professional working life. And but probably it came instinctively to me, but it's not something that may come instinctively to others. But of course, at the same time, through the life skills training, we can actually sort of inculcate this kind of mindsets that can help us to take on any challenges that are thrown our way. So today we are going to be talking about design thinking. Of course, how the session will pan out is we will first talk about how do we typically innovate today. And then we will also talk about how design thinking can help us in the innovation process. So I will take you through the processes, the tools, and what are the pillars of the design thinking process. But what I also really want to do is sort of equate how we can use design thinking in today's scenario when we have been faced with this unprecedented times. And how design thinking can help us in coming up with solutions or in designing outcomes that can actually be very innovative and meaningful. So bringing on the slides, going to my first slide here. So unprecedented times require us to act in a manner that is bold and new. The hitherto unknown challenges require innovation and a growth mindset to be able to design outcomes that are humane and human-centric. I think the important things here to really focus on are having outcomes that are humane and human centric. So, as we battle this pandemic, as we battle the coronavirus, it's very easy to sort of let go of that, let go of our compassion, let go of our empathy, and only respond to the immediate challenge on hand. But for any long lasting solution, I think it's going to be very important that we keep our solutions humane and human centric. So, going forward, what is wrong with the way we think and innovate now? Uh, so, I would typically actually throw this question open to you all, but since I don't have the privilege of interaction with you, I would also request you to think of the responses and sort of, uh, I don't know, but at least just think of it in your head. So, how do you typically solve problems now? So, when you're confronted with your problem, what is your first uh, kind of a response to it? What process do you follow? Do you have a process that you follow? When you follow that process and you come out with a solution, are you really happy with the outcome? What are the challenges that you face with those outcomes? Give it a thought to actually what is the kind of process that you follow. Mostly, we follow a process which is very linear. So we have this big idea and we plan for that idea and we put it into action. That's how we do it. So for example, if you had this problem of or we have already had a solution to this problem, but suppose if the problem was that you needed to get a patient very quickly from his or her home to a hospital, or you wanted to get how would you do it? So when we were confronted with this problem, what we did is we sort of looked around us. We tried to see what other countries are doing, and we realized that there was this option of using an ambulance with the red lights blazing, which could sort of chart its course among the traffic, and which would be given priority among all the cars, and it could take the patient and transport the patient to the hospital. We applied it. We just picked it up. We applied it. Did we actually try to see whether that kind of a solution would work in a context like ours, for example, in a Dhaka city, where the traffic can be at standstill for hours actually, and that's not an exaggeration. And I saw this very funny kind of scenario maybe a couple of years back. So I was traveling in my car and I was in this lane and we were moving in one direction, and there was an ambulance behind my car, and it was obviously sort of beeping, and it had its siren on and its lights were blazing, but there was just no way it could pass because the traffic was chock a block. So obviously these ambulance had to reach quickly. So what it did was it crossed over to the opposite lane, and and that was empty, but it was in the opposite direction. But since it was an ambulance, I think the driver thought out of the box and started going in that direction. But you know what happened? The other cars in my lane also followed the ambulance, and you can imagine the anarchy that was created because you now had cars going in both the directions, and the whole purpose was completely lost. So that is what I'm trying to say is that when we are confronted with a problem, we usually think of it in a very linear way. We do not try to sort of innovate or think differently. And why does this happen? Because we respond to problems based on the kind of conditioning and the kind of experiences that we have had. That has shaped the pattern of our thinking, and that is known as the problem with the ingrained pattern of thinking, right? So many times we hear this phrase, right? Think out of the box, think out of the box. But why is thinking out of the box really so difficult? It is really difficult, because of the fact that we have developed a pattern of thinking, we have modeled it on repetitive activities, and we have this body of knowledge which has sort of shaped our thinking, and we keep accessing that to create our responses. To show how this actually happens is take the example of this truck that is on the road, and it is trying to pass under a very low bridge. uh, the driver says that okay, maybe I can just pass through. He tries to take the truck under the bridge, but the truck gets stuck. Now he cannot even reverse it, and nor can he sort of pass under the bridge. So obviously, it creates a huge traffic jam. A lot of people, it's sort of obstructing traffic. So it has attracted a lot of people. Emergency workers have been called. There are firefighters who come. There are other truck drivers who come. There are medical personnel who come, and everybody starts thinking about how to resolve the situation. So, for example, the emergency workers suggest that why not should we chip away at the bridge? The truck driver says, let's dismantle the truck, you know. So here everybody is responding based on the kind of experience or the kind of training that they have had. At that point of time, there's a young boy who's passing through the scene, and when he takes in the entire scenario, he very nonchalantly says that why don't you just let out the air from the tires? And when that is done, actually the truck sort of settles down and is able to pass under the bridge very conveniently without suffering any further damage. Now, why was this boy able to come up with something that was such an obvious solution? And why were the other trained and expert individuals not able to see this? Because the boy was still untouched by, relatively untouched, I would say, by the filters or by the codes that sort of start uh, influencing our thinking. He was still, his mind was relatively still a clean slate, and he was not afraid to think looking at the problem. He was not thinking of any situations or any problems that may arise in implementing that situation. So sometimes these obvious solutions are more difficult for us. When we see a tree, we just dismiss it as a tree, right? We just walk ahead. We never question why should an orange be sweet or why are we stopping at the traffic light. Suppose if you were to stop and actually look at a tree and understand it and remove the labels that this is not a tree. Let me look at it afresh. Let me look at it as a maybe an object that has trunk and then it has leaves and there is sunlight that's coming in through the leaves and it's forming a pattern at my feet. Then it would open a whole new world. It would allow us to make new connections, and when you make new connections, then there would be new ideas. That's how ideas are born, and that's very difficult for us to really leave behind all the judgments that we have or all the fetters that we have in our mind. So now that we know what thinking out of the box means and how difficult it is, I would just like to do a small exercise with you. So you can see here three objects, and of course, I cannot get your responses, but just to sort of jog your muscles, your creative muscles, what I would like to do with you is to tell me that suppose if you have this stack of old newspapers, and somebody gifted this stack of old newspapers to you. Now, that's not some gift that you would really like. If someone were to do that, you would actually say, oh, he's so stingy or she's so stingy and she's so unimaginative. What am I going to do with a stack of old newspapers? If you were to be thinking in the way that you usually think, like not applying design thinking, but in normally how you think, you would say that, oh, probably I will use the stack of old newspapers to, I don't know, maybe, sort of accumulate it and then sell it off and earn a few takas. What else would you do with it actually? So to give an example, what I have been doing with these newspapers is actually I've been using these newspapers to wrap gifts for my friends. For the last couple of years, I've not invested in buying any wrapping paper. All my gifts are wrapped in the newspapers that come to my house. And even so, the gifts that I carry for my friends outside of Bangladesh or to other international destinations have also been wrapped in newspapers. And actually, it has served the dual purpose. One is, of course, that I've saved the felling of trees. I mean, I've not bought wrapping paper, which is actually made from the trees and leads to more death of the trees. It also sort of serves a purpose of when people are looking, when people get these gifts wrapped in the newspapers and they open it, then they can also sort of get a glimpse into the country from where I'm coming from. Like it would contain news about Bangladesh. It would contain news on that day about Bangladesh, and that is another added element that is added to the gift. Moving on to say the hairbands. Uh, I think this is something that's all over the internet. All of us have a lot of, I mean, many of us who are ladies and who are watching this would have hairbands, or if you have sisters or daughters, there would be hairbands. And typically, of course, these hairbands do is help us to keep the hair off the face, right? But also in recent times, because of the situation that we've had, and there has been a shortage of the face mask, they've already internet. We have been able to see how people have been innovative, and they have made face masks out using these by threading the hair bands through the plastic folders and actually wearing it across the forehead, and it makes a mask which then covers your eyes and nose and the mouth. So that's already a very good example of how our everyday objects can be turned with a little creative muscles into something that is really useful. And the last one that you can see here is a pair of glasses. This I would like you all to sort of think a little about. Suppose if my challenge to you here would be that these are a pair of glasses. I would like you to relate these glasses to a fitness app. I mean, suppose if you were making a fitness app, then how could these glasses be incorporated into it? Give it a job, give it a thought. I'm sure you'll come up with great solutions. So that brings us now we should dive into what design thinking is all about and how is it different from the way we've been thinking and innovating till now. So this is my favorite uh, image or diagram that I usually use to explain design thinking. There are three or four, there are a couple of other images that I use to explain design thinking. This double diamond, we call it double diamonds. You can see that there are two diamonds out here. And this double diamond is something that was sort of popularized by the design school at Stanford. And I personally like it because it explains the essence very well. Before I actually explain the double diamond, I would like to spend a few minutes in actually talking about what does design thinking mean. If I were asked the question, what is design thinking or what the fuss is about in design thinking, then very simply put, I would say that design thinking is an approach to problem solving, and it is used to innovate. Very important two things are there, that it is an approach to problem solving, of course, but it is also used to innovate, right? And also, what is at the core of any design thinking is the fact that it puts the user at the center. It puts your audience, it puts your target audience right at the center. It consults the user every step of the way. Not after you have designed the product or after you have designed the service and then you launch it and then you want to change the habits of the user through advertising or through marketing to actually use your product. For example, you launch a hair oil and without finding out what actually are the problems that the women are facing, and then you spend crores on advertising and marketing, but you've actually not been able to design a product that the user wanted, right? So it's very important to consult the user, to co-create with the user, and adopting design thinking gives you that opportunity. Then the question comes is, what is this for whom is this design thinking? Oh, before I move on to whom, actually, I would also like to give you one example of a situation where, for example, we did not, if we would not have consulted the user, what a catastrophe it could have been. So when I was designing this web-based platform for a anti-trafficking project, and my users were NGOs that were based in Bangladesh, India, and Nepal. It was a cross-border project. And we designed a web-based platform that actually brought together, say, 30 plus actors. 30 plus actors could use it. 70 plus activities could be done through that platform, could be shown on the dashboard of that platform. And then we decided, why not include a feature which would allow scanning of documents and keeping a repository of the documents, because documents were very important in that platform. But before we did that, because we were already applying design thinking, we of course sort of made a prototype and we went to our users and asked them that, does this feature seem useful to you? And do you want this feature? And good, we did that because we realized that many of our users actually do not even have smartphones, let alone a scanning machine, and so this feature was much ahead of its time. So we parked that feature, and because we did not want to spend time and effort, but we just parked it. We did not cancel it because obviously rapid advancements mean that soon your user will get access to the technology that will allow this feature to be something that is really worthy and useful. Then moving on, for whom is design thinking? So, the first thing that when you hear the word design, I think that comes to your mind is that it is only for designers and for creative persons. But that's not true, actually. Design thinking is being used by architects, it's being used by engineers, educators, lawyers. Everybody has used it. In fact, in terms of organizations as well, Apple has used it, Amazon has used it. IBM actually has trained more than, I think, 1/3 of their staff on design thinking. So it's something that is universally applicable. And then when did we actually start using design thinking? So design thinking first came into the realm, I think, in the 1960s. And thereafter, it's been continuously used. It has been used for industrial design, it has been used for architecture, it has been used for product design. So it has become a really universal approach to problem solving. Once we've got that out of the way, I think one important thing that I would really like to touch upon is, when you talk about when you talk about a new concept, or when you talk about a new tool, or when you talk about a new process, usually we are sort of bombarded with the do's and the don'ts, and we are given very rigid principles by which those concepts, or a very rigid framework within which that concept needs to be applied. It's, you must have heard of standard operating procedures. So, and there's a big code that is there of by which you should apply that concept. But that's why for design thinking, in fact, there is no such code. So I would rather speak about what design thinking is not about. So design thinking is definitely not about best practices. There are no standard operating procedures for application of design thinking. And here again, to sort of reinforce what I'm trying to say is, many of you all must have seen the movie. I think it was called Sully. It was based on a real life incident, and the main character was played by Tom Hanks. And he was a pilot who made an emergency landing of an. He played the role of a pilot who made the emergency landing of his plane on the Hudson River in New York, saving all 155 passengers aboard. So actually, of course, he had a manual that he had to follow. So according to the manual, he should have actually taken the plane to the nearest airfield to land it. And obviously, there was an investigation and inquiry that was held into why did he not follow that manual. But then they realized that if he would have moved towards landing at the nearest airfield, then it would have been too late and all the passengers would have lost their life. So he took a risk, and because he was successful, I think he was not sort of, I think that it's called, I don't know, equivalent of court martial maybe, but he did not lose his job or he was not punished. But it just brings to the light that there are no best practices that you need to follow in design thinking. You need to take a risk, and only when you take a risk will you be able to innovate. Now, looking at the double diamond, if you can see that the first triangle of the double diamond, it talks about empathy, right? It talks about empathizing. And that is the first step in starting your design thinking journey. Empathy means putting yourself in the shoes of the others. It is a centerpiece. Empathy is a centerpiece. I cannot stress enough on it, but empathy is a centerpiece of any design process. And how does that happen? So, empathy is understanding the human needs that are involved. So, if you're faced with a problem comes to you. What is your next step? The next step is for you to understand as much about the audience or the user who is facing that problem. For example, the problem that came to you may talk about that there is that your stakeholders maybe do not have access to clean drinking water. Now you need to understand why do they not have access to the clean drinking water. You need to empathize with them. You need to put yourself in their shoes. Is it because the source of water is very far away? Is it because they do not know how to carry the source of water to their homes? Is it because that's being used by industries? Is it because it's being used? Is it because there's a lot of wastage? Is it because it's not potable? Is it because there's no recycling happening? So empathy is very important. Putting yourself into your user's shoes and trying to understand that why are they facing that problem? What are their pain points? Where is the gap, and which is leading to them facing a problem? So identifying the problem is very important. And if you look at the double diamond here, the empathize feature comes in the first triangle, which at this triangle is diverging. So at this stage, you are like a child who has left behind all the judgments, who has left behind all the knowledge that you have gained over the years, who has left behind all the filters that are there in your mind, and are going there like a child to discover everything that you can about the problem. And that is why the triangle sort of diverges and says that just take in everything without filtering. Listen, empathy is not only to be practiced in design thinking. Empathy is to be practiced in every facet of our life, but it's easier said than done, right? It's very difficult to sort of keep quiet, let the other speak, do not make judgments, actually listen to the other person, actually listen what that person is trying to say. We are so used to when we see a person dressed in a particular manner, or when we see a person carrying a particular phone, we've already decided in our mind what that person is going to say. We've already decided how that person is going to behave. Very few occasions we actually keep quiet and we actually listen and try to understand what that person is saying. And that is what is the first step in the design thinking process. That is what you actually need to do, is actually become like a child in a candy shop who has never seen the world, and this is the you must pretend as if this is the first time that you're hearing about the problem. Once you've done that, then of course begins the process of making sense out of all that you have heard. And you will see the second triangle. So now we are sort of converging towards the problem. Now is the time that you will need to find out patterns in what you heard or and what you heard. You will have to find themes. You will have to find meaning in what you have heard, right? You'll have to translate all the research that you did into actionable frameworks and actionable tools, right? So, for example, if you were grappling with a problem in the retail sector, if somebody said that there is a lot of, please redesign the experience for me at a at a at a shopping complex. There are long lines that are there, and I take a lot of time for the customers to check out. So it's at this point of time that after you've spoken to your stakeholders, you've spoken to the customers, you've spoken to the cashiers, you've spoken to the management, that you will reframe the problem and say that the problem is not about how might we reduce the customer waiting time, but the problem is actually how might we reduce the perceived waiting time, what's in the mind of the customer. So that is the time when you actually sort of identify the problem, what actually the problem is, and what part of the problem do you want to work on. And that's what brings you to this convergence here. Then again, so here, that's my here slide. Definition, reconstruction of problems the human centric way. Oh yes, this is very very important, that when you have defined your problem, when you have framed your problem, it's very important to again focus on the user. So the problem should be defined in a manner that focuses on the user. So when I gave the example, I said my reframe problem would be, how can we reduce the perceived waiting time? Again, the perceived waiting time of whom? Of the customer who comes, because they are my users. I'm designing for them. Moving on, we then come to ideation. So this is again, if you notice now, this is second diamond, and here we are again diverging. Again, ideation is a point where we need to put on a creative hat and we need to sort of give wing to our ideas, but without any filters, right? So here you are thinking about all the possible options that can be done to take care of the problem. And sometimes, we are sort of already in our minds, we have decided that this solution will not work, that solution will not work. So we come up with only that solution or that idea which we think will work, because we've again applied our self-imposed judgments. We've again applied the knowledge that we've had. We've again applied our self-imposed filters. And that is why actually design thinking works best when you're working in a multidisciplinary team. So, for example, if you were to be launching a new product, or if you were to be designing a new product or a new service, it would be worthwhile to have all representation from your company on that team. So it would be worthwhile to say have a marketing personnel onto it, because that person would be able to understand how to position the product or the service. It would be worthwhile to probably have the salespeople on the team, because they know the pulse of the people that they go to. It would probably be worthwhile to have the customer service department or customer service personnel on the team, because they have been in direct contact with the customers and they know what are the pain points of the user that you're trying to design for. And then, of course, it may be really useful to have somebody from the top management, buy in from the top management, because they will actually smoothen the way for the out of the box or the innovative idea that you want to implement. So at the ideation stage, there are many tools. I mean, I'm not getting into tools actually for this session, because for each of the stages, there are a number of tools that you can use to sort of get through the stages, because we don't have time for that today, but you can probably find it. And so ideation is actually the time when you just let your creative imagination go. You are not thinking whether the idea is going to be working or not. You're trying to be as innovative, you're thinking out of the box, and that's your sole focus at this stage. Once you've done that, and suppose you get, say, 50 ideas, now again begins the process of converging on that one idea or on that couple of ideas that are actually going to work. So here, a very important process that we follow, a very important step that I think is unique to design thinking is prototyping. Prototyping is what we prototyping means make it. Simply put, just make it. So whatever ideas you have thought of or whatever solutions you have come up, maybe you came up with 50, maybe you came up with 100. Look at those ideas, relate it back to your problem, and try to think of maybe 5 or 6 of them that would actually work, right? And make those. So right now you have been working in teams. You went to the user right at the beginning when you were empathizing with them. Then you started defining the problem. Then you started looking at the solutions, and now again you've been on your own for some time. So now again it's time to go back to the user. So make a prototype of the kind of solutions that you've thought of. Prototype can be done in many different ways. You can either just the best thing that I prefer, frankly, is using pen and paper and just making some quick sketches. Or you can also use cardboard to make a 3D model, or you can actually use make clickable PowerPoints, or you can actually even do a role play, or maybe make a video. So there are many ways in which you can make prototype. The essence here, or the focus here, is on making it very quickly and without much cost. Why is that important? Because only when you invest limited time and limited resources and limited money into making something will you be open to taking any criticism, will you be open to accepting any suggestions for improvement. If you spend a lot of time and effort in making a prototype, then you will become attached to your solution, and that's exactly what we don't want. So once you've done the prototype, you actually go with that prototype to your users. You ask them, does this work for you? Does this take care of your pain points? Will it be useful for you? They will give you feedback, and you need to come back and iterate. Again, iteration is a very important step in design thinking process. Iteration means making changes in your prototype, in your design, in your solution based on the feedback that you've got from the user. And this can be a back and forth which can go on for some time, maybe 3 or 4 times, depending on the bandwidth that you have, depending on the time you have, depending on the resources that you have. So and once you've done that and you've done a fair amount of back and forth and you've iterated, and then you will be closer to finding that particular solution that actually solves the problem that you set out to solve in the first instance. The way I've talked about the process may seem very linear, but actually it's not a linear process. So if you see, you have these circles that I have here. So when you have empathized and you're trying to define the problem, there are times that you will go back and you will check whether it actually, the problem statement that you are defining, is it actually taking care of the pain point of the user. When you have ideated and then you're prototyping and you're testing, you're again coming back. So you may run into a block. You may run into a situation where actually the prototype that you prepare is not something that the user is very excited about, or it actually does not address the needs of the user. No problem. You will again come back to the solutions that you had ideated, or go into the mode of ideation again, and then again come back and prototype. So it's a very back and forth kind of a process and not a linear process. And I think that's the most important thing which helps to distinguish it from the traditional ways of innovating. So that's in a nutshell how the design thinking process works. Apart from this, the 4 other elements of design thinking that I would like to really to sort of quickly focus on is that design thinking is a process of finding and solving problems. You may find it very funny when I say that it's a process of finding a problem and solving a problem, but that is actually what it is. You know, what happens is that when a problem comes to us, we immediately start thinking about the solution. It's very rare that we actually spend some time on the problem itself. So Albert Einstein had once said that if he had like 1 hour to solve a problem, the first 55 minutes he would actually focus on the problem and maybe only 5 minutes on the solution. Because once you know what the problem is, it's only then that you can actually find the solution. So design thinking actually allows you to spend that time on finding what the problem is. to give an example here, there was a gentleman who had been in General Electric for 25 years, and he had spent 2.5 years on sort of perfecting an MRI scan machine. What you can see here is actually an MRI scan machine, but I'll get to the story of how it came to take this form and shape. So he spent a lot of time and he got the technology completely right. It was tested. He got a lot of awards for this MRI scan machine that he developed. And then he had the opportunity to install it at a hospital and to see it being used. And once it had been installed in the room that it was supposed in the room that the MRI scans were to take place, the technician requested him to wait outside in the corridor. He went outside and then he saw this young girl approaching him. She was very young. She had tears running down her cheeks. Her parents were with her and they were trying to console her and tell her that, remember, we talked about this. Remember, you said that you would be brave. It will be over before you know it. So she was dreading the fact that she would have to go through an MRI scan. And no amount of consoling could actually give her courage. And then what this gentleman sees is the one who had invented the MRI machine, that he saw the technician pick up the phone and actually call for an anesthesiologist, to give anesthesia to this little girl. And he discovered that sedating pediatric patients was routine because the young children, they could just not lie still enough, for a long time so as to complete the scan, and they were terrified of getting into this machine. We as adults are scared of getting into an MRI scan machine. Remember, if a young child has to get into it. So that had him thinking, that really shook him up. And though he had the best innovation in place, he actually was he started looking at it from the perspective of a young child. And when he looked at this MRI scan machine from the perspective of a young child, it actually looked like a scary machine. So then he said, what can I do for this? So he had a suggestion that, why don't you go to design school at Stanford and why don't you learn about design thinking? And he did just that. And that gave him a new perspective. And he said, okay, the problem here is I have the technology, but I have to make the experience appealing to the young users, right? I mean, the problem here is not the technology. The problem here is not the MRI machine, but the problem here is the dreadful or the scary experience that the children have. So he sort of started empathizing with his audience. His audience had now become the young children, and he started empathizing with these young children. And how did he do that? He went to daycare centers and spent days out there observing the children. He spoke to child psychologists. He spoke to parents, and he started understanding what would actually make this experience a little less scary for the children. And so what you see in this image is actually what he designed. One of the experiences that he designed was that, which is worthy of being put in an amusement park. It's like a pirate ship with a wooden wheel, which the sort of the captain of the ship can actually run. And so the whole thing became like a ride or like an amusement ride for the children. The technicians were trained to tell the children that when they would be put into there would be a lot of noise, and they had to that would be because of bad weather, and they had just to lie still, and then there would be another change in the tone, which would mean that the ship had arrived at its destination. So this is how he made the whole awful and scary experience into a very beautiful experience for the children. And there was a sharp drop in the number of children that required anesthesia after this. So very, very important to find out what problem are you trying to solve here. So find the gap. The next is, design thinking is a process of deducing the essence of problems based on their own limitations. So what does that mean? Again, a very important example here that I can give, and which will sort of explain how this works, is that there was this high-rise building in New York, and during the peak hours in the morning or the evening, there used to be huge lines outside the elevators, right? And people used to spend a lot of time, 20 minutes, maybe half an hour, to actually get to their destination or to get to their desired flow. And there were a lot of complaints that were given to the management of the building that you must change the lift because it's taking away a lot of our productive time. And if you don't do that, we will shift our offices somewhere else. And so the management called a meeting and they discovered what to do. The elevator was very old, but they discovered that the cost of replacing the elevator with new technology would be immense. And it's not really justified considering that the building itself was old. And then there was a psychologist on board of that team, and he said he started empathizing with the users, with these people who were waiting outside the lift, and he discovered that the problem is not the fact that they're spending time, or that there is a line, or that they're waiting in a line, but the problem was that they were really bored while they were doing this. And so he came up with the idea of, why not just install mirrors outside the elevator. And when that was done, suddenly miraculously the problem disappeared for a lot of people because they spend that time in looking at themselves in the mirror. They spend that time in looking at people who are standing behind in line, and suddenly the whole thing had just become into nothing. So it's very important to understand which part of the problem do you want to solve, and you have to understand your limitations. The limitation here was that you could not replace the lift because the cost would be prohibitive, and it would not justify, considering that the building itself was very old. And an old building having this high tech elevator would not work. So then actually finding out the crux of the problem, that's very important in design thinking. Design thinking is also an extreme user centered process. Who do we mean by extreme users? So there are some users who are going to be who are always going to be using your product. But if you really want to get insights into designing products or services that are sort of innovative and which will appeal to a wide range of users, it's very important to listen to extreme users. For example, say a shopping cart is usually designed to carry, say, two children for a family of four, where there are two children who can sit in the cart. But what happens if a family has, say, five children? Thinking about them. Or suppose elderly users. Elderly users are your extreme users in most cases. What are the challenges that they would face if in using your app or in using your product could actually give you important insights into how to change your product or what features you should include. Or suppose if also studying competition helps a lot. So if you're trying to improve the service in a hospital, it may make sense to also look at how the service is being provided in the hospitality industry in the hotels. And that would sort of give you an important insights into how you can change the way the service is being provided in hospitals. So very important. It's an extreme user-centered process. Do not only focus on your mainstream, but also at an extreme user. And then design thinking is a process of integrating different things into a system. So it's not just about thinking of a solution. Once you've thought, so, again, I don't have time for that, but usually design thinking has three circles. One is that your product must be desirable. It must be actually fulfilling the needs of the users. Second is it must be feasible. The technology that is available, the resources that are available, it must be something that can be actually brought in, sort of implemented by the technology and the resources that are available. And third is it must be sustainable. There must be a business plan, there must be a revenue plan, or there must be a funding plan which will help you to take forward these solutions. And also, which also at this stage, you should also include that what are the different other systems that you need to take care of. For example, if you were designing a healthcare app, then what would be important here to consider? You would have to consider that there are busy doctors. You would have to consider that there is stressful work. You would have to consider that there are patients may have different moods. What about the hospital space and the rest of the equipment? So there's a lot of juggling, and you have to fit in all the different aspects like a jigsaw puzzle, or basically take the holistic approach, as I say. So that's in a nutshell about design thinking. And now I would like to move on to how we can actually apply design thinking to the situation that we are facing now, and whether actually design thinking can be used in such a situation. Can we redesign the responses? So a lot of us over the past 4 weeks, while we've been going through a lockdown, there have been a lot of debate. We've had to change the way we live. Overnight we've had to change the way we work. Overnight the students have had to change the way that they study, or and the parents have had to change the way that they spend time with their children. And this has thrown open a lot of problems. We didn't have time to sort of think about our responses. Remember when we started thinking about how do we typically solve problems that come our way? We start thinking about the solution from the word go. And because of the transition that happened, because of the lockdown that happened so suddenly, because of the fact that the situation deteriorated so suddenly, we've actually not had time to think through what our response should be. So can we think differently now? How can we create contextualized and effective responses? And here, let's look a little back. I mean, let's try to see whether design thinking has actually been used in the past for sort of responding to a similar situation. So yes, it was. Many of you must know about Ebola, which was, I think it was only 5 years ago, and it was in West Africa. It was a disease that struck West Africa, and the mortality rate was much higher there. It was around 50%. At that time, the WHO and the Center for Disease Control and Prevention, they approach IDEO, one of the world's leading design thinking firms, to innovate and to design simple, low cost, and most importantly, human centric ways to sort of support the efforts in limiting the impact of the Ebola virus. So yes, another comparable kind of pandemic that happened just 5 years ago. That was the situation when actually design thinking was used to come up with innovative solutions. And I think one particular solution that I just loved and which I've made the centerpiece today is this solution actually related to maintaining social distance to reduce proximity to infected people. And what was the solution? It was a it was an umbrella. It was a yellow parasol or a yellow umbrella. And what was the thing was that those undergoing treatment, it was suggested that they be covered by a yellow parasol or a yellow umbrella, and it would have many purposes. So once you had this yellow parasol that was put over the bed, the radius of that parasol would actually represent the area that was supposed to be the infected area and which should not be approached, right? At the same time, the fact that there was this yellow parasol over a bed would give out signals to other people that this was an area of treatment, that people were being treated out here. And third, and I think the most important signal or the most important message that comes out of this yellow parasol idea was that it was a very bright color. And so it sort of evoked positive emotions in the patient, and it was a powerful association with relaxation. So unlike the stigma of okay, a patient having an Ebola and should be kept away and should not be approached, but the fact that that thought went into sort of identifying that patient was something that really stood out. And this solution was implemented in some way. So today, when we are talking of the pandemic, today when we are talking of responding to the coronavirus, I would like to again put the spotlight on the stigma in social distancing. Right, we've been facing this a lot over the past month. There have been stories about how it's becoming very difficult for people with COVID to access medical health. It's also becoming very difficult to maintain social countries like Bangladesh or maybe India and Pakistan, which are densely populated. Secondly, which has a huge population of migrant workers, which has a huge population of daily wage earners. So maintaining the social distancing is not something that's really working. Again, what we did was we just picked up a solution which the West is implementing, social distancing. But did we think about how it's actually going to work in a context of, say, South Asia, which are densely populated, first of all, which have many people, like the family members? There could be 6 7 people living in a like 400 or 500 square feet. How do you maintain social physical distancing? Let's use the term physical distancing. How do you maintain that? How do you tell people do not come out to work, stay in your homes when they have to come out to work every day if they are to eat their next meal? How do you so if you see these kind of, how do you tell people to stay in their homes when they're actually not in their homes, when they're in a city that is far away from their homes, when they're living in rented apartments or they're living in rented habitats? How do you tell them that stay in your rented one, do not go back to your family? So these are peculiar challenges which maybe South Asia has, and many of the other countries that have similar socio-economic conditions would be facing. And why? So just picking that solution up from the West and implementing here has not really worked. We've also had a lot of people. I've read stories, and I'm sure you have as well, where actually people have been very wary of saying from where they come, even if they are going to a specific hospital for some other kind of a disease. So I recently read that a patient went with a heart condition to a heart hospital, and he was admitted, but his relatives did not say that he came from a hotspot, from an area that was a hotspot of COVID, for fear of being turned away. And then in fact, the building, I've seen a building where they put up a red flag saying that this is the building where there is a person that has COVID stays. So all this just is creating stigma rather than, and we've lost all compassion, and we are not looking at the problem with empathetic eyes. We are not understanding that it's actually just creating more of a confusion, and it's actually not leading to any solutions. So my question to you today would be, challenge to you today would be, in terms of after having listened to me and having understood what design thinking is all about, is this challenge that I would like to take is how can we keep distance and yet stay united? Because, because of the fact that it's become so difficult to enforce physical distancing, that there is a cacophony of voices. There's a lot of blame game that is being played out right now. So let's put on our design thinking caps and see how we can keep distance and yet stay united. So when you are working on this problem, when you're working on this challenge, a few things that I would leave you with in terms of how you're going to design the solution is, by taking you through these a few things that you should keep in mind. First and foremost is, do not base your solutions on a knee jerk reaction. The kind of situation that we are facing, it's very new, right? We have to keep the user at the center, but remember that the user in this case will have needs which will be constantly evolving. What we knew last week, we didn't know the week before that. What we know today, we did not know last week, right? So the situation is constantly evolving. So make sure that when you design, you are also providing for the fact that there could be changes in your users' needs. There could be a change scenario. So first and foremost, do not panic build. Second is, remember that you are designing for different users and one shoe size will not fit here. So, of course, it's a health pandemic and health is important to everybody, but your users are different out here. You may be designing for the health workers who have been thrown in the line of duty and who have to attend to the COVID patients and are rightly fearful for their families primarily. Or you may be thinking of a solution for, say, a daily wage earners, or you may be thinking of a solution for an employer. How does an employer respond to the situation where there are no earnings happening and yet he needs to continue paying the salaries of his people? Or you may be thinking from the point of view of a patient who has the signs, who's not feeling well and needs to get tested and needs to get admitted and is for COVID treatment. So remember you're designing for different users, and remember that one shoe size does not fit all. The third thing to keep in mind is always that having this mindset of collaboration. And collaboration is always important in design thinking, but more so in today's situation when you're designing for a pandemic. You need to be able to share your ideas. You need to be able to share the logic behind your ideas with other people. Build on what the other people have done. Uh, Allow space for that dialogue. Allow space for that feedback. Allow space for that criticism. Allow space for making changes to what you're thinking about. So do not reinvent the wheel. Do not duplicate things, because we do not have the time and the resources to do that. So adopt a mindset of collaboration. The fourth thing is inclusive innovation. So, as I said, when we had to make that sudden transition, say, of working from home, take the example of work from home, those of us who were technology savvy, or those of us who were already working in jobs where we had the opportunity to work from home at certain points of time, quickly made the transition. But there have been other cases where people were not used to using technology, and they have sort of lagged behind in adapting to this change. And then there are others who may actually be completely left behind because they do not have access to technology. They do not have access to devices that will help them to access technology. So design inclusively. Make sure that be bold with your solutions so as to include everybody. Be mindful of the digital divide when you're designing your solutions. The fifth one would be iterate and iterate. One of the pillars of design thinking, and something that you should be ready to do when you're designing for a COVID response, is that choose your battles. You cannot design for all the problems. So choose what part of the problem you want to solve, and keep making changes, because the reality because the situation is also going to be changing rapidly. So you need to be able to take care of those changes, keep incorporate those changes into your problem, and then again design with a fresh lens, right? So you need to be ready to keep making changes till you get that perfect solution. And the last one, which is the most important thing in any design thinking exercise, is keeping the user at the center at all times. And in this case, especially when you're designing any kind of a response or a solution for the pandemic, it's important to practice compassion and empathy. Nothing is possible without that. So put yourself in your user's shoes. Understand how that user would feel if he or she required treatment and people all just ran away. Put yourself in the shoes of that doctor who's going out and is actually attending to COVID patients and comes back to his home and is asked by his tenant, by his landlord to sort of vacate. Put yourself in the shoes of that migrant worker who uh, who wants to go back home, has to pay a huge amount of money for as rent in the place that he is staying in, say Dhaka city, but has lost his job and has nothing to pay the rent with. Or put yourself in the shoes of that daily wage earner who has no customers now, who cannot decide where his next meal is going to come from. So let us not forget our compassion and empathy in this time of the pandemic. And keeping all these things in mind, I would urge you to sort of go back to my challenge, which is how can we keep distance and yet stay united? Can you design the yellow parasol for Bangladesh? Let's see if any one of you are able to design that one solution which will stand out. And if you want to share your solutions, I would love to hear about it from you at Yellow Umbrella for BD at gmail.com. There is a typo there which shows a comma, but it's .com. So I hope that you will send in your solutions and maybe we can take it forward from there. Thank you, everybody, for listening in. Thank you for making time. And I look forward to staying connected.